So let me just get started here. I'd like to start by saying hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining today's IDC webinar, DevOps Authenticating Users to the Right Resources Without Roadblocks. We'd like to take a minute here just to give a brief overview. Today we'll discuss the importance of security integration into the DevOps toolchain. DevOps has broken down the walls between deployment and operation teams to deliver and innovate faster than ever before. Now security, compliance, and audit groups have to be a part of the DevOps conversation as well. How can these diverse interest groups within an organization be brought together to ensure the right people have access to the right resources? The time it takes to provision, manage, secure access is the bottleneck to continuous DevOps delivery. So today we will cover how SSH is an essential part of the DevOps toolchain, but managing the access SSH provides is an obstacle to continuous delivery. Today's speakers are Stephen Elliott, IDC Program Vice President, Management Software and DevOps. Stephen Elliott manages multiple programs spanning IT operations, enterprise management, ITSM, Agile, and DevOps, application performance, virtualization, multi-cloud management, and automation, log analytics, and much more. Mr. Elliott advises senior IT business and investment executives globally in the creation of strategy and operational tactics that drive execution of digital transformation and business growth. We're also joined today by John Walsh, SSH Communications Security Director of Product Marketing. John serves as Director of Product Marketing at SSH Communications Security, where he's focused on raising industry awareness of risk and compliance issues of unmanaged credentials. John has over 15 years of experience in the IT security industry, having held product management, product marketing, and software engineering positions at such companies as IBM and here at SSH Communications Security. So with all that said, I'd like to turn it over right now to Stephen Elliott. Stephen, welcome.
Hey, Red, thank you. And it's great to be here. So at IDC, we spend a lot of time with enterprise IT organizations, and particularly around DevOps and security topics. And one of the things we wanted to do is share some of the data that we've collected to really give some perspective and to set the stage for this conversation. First and foremost, as you can see with this content here, we interviewed 100 IT executives, and we really simply asked them, are your DevOps teams working with your security audit and compliance teams? And as you can see, what we found is that generally, yes, there's some execution there, but it's really on an ad hoc basis. And when you think about this area of DevOps, DevSecOps, as some people call it, there's a tremendous amount of interest. There are lots of conversations going on between DevOps teams, IT executives, and security teams. But we still haven't seen that inflection point where we're getting more and more organizations standardizing the process, really recognizing the importance of having security teams as part of the early stage of DevOps projects. So one of the things we're really always advising clients is to think about the inclusion of security conversations when you're doing your DevOps projects. There's a lot of opportunity for innovation, and there's certainly a lot of things that, as one executive recently put it in our conversations, that this executive wants to make security just a feature of the application. So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation, and then certainly a lot of opportunity to take risk out of the equation as it relates to DevOps projects. So this next one, again, a lot of companies often ask, well, what's the importance of this? But it's even more important in terms of critical application failures. So as you can see here, again, from the Save DevOps survey, we're seeing an average annual cost of application failures between $500,000 and $750,000. And frankly, that's probably pretty conservative when you look at the mission critical applications when they go down, and when you think about all the different nuances that security plays with risk mitigation, as well as avoiding downtime costs because of security threats. And it's not just about the revenue. This is about companies' reputations. This is about the importance of really understanding, how you can innovate with security earlier in the application development lifecycle. And then certainly when you're talking about DevOps, it's not just the dev side of it, where a lot of companies often start, but the ops side of it. And infrastructure and operations teams are increasingly getting involved with security discussions, particularly from a network standpoint. to understand how APIs, how applications are going to be deployed and managed on modern application and modern network architectures. And then certainly when you bring security into the fold, realizing that security features, security requirements never dissipate, right? It doesn't matter what the underlying architecture is. If you have a software-defined network, if you have deployment of container architectures, you're using Git, maybe using some type of platform as a service cloud, the security requirements are always going to be there. And if you're in a heavily regulated environment, of course, compliance requirements are always there. So we always ask executives in these conversations, well, why not include security? Why don't you think about, what the security pre-requirements are for a particular application? And then as you're reinventing with DevOps and agile development processes, how you're going to deploy, create, and manage these apps, make security part of that theme. Because let's face it, there's a lot of opportunities here for innovation that can drive critical application failures down, but there's also an opportunity to increase the security of these applications before you even write a line of code. So there's a lot of opportunities here across the security and DevOps discussions. Now, defining DevOps is always an interesting discussion with IT executives and their teams, because a lot of times there are a lot of snowflakes. In other words, everybody's got their own different definition of what does DevOps mean to their organization, how do they deploy it, and then what are the business outcomes and how they discuss these outcomes. So IDC put together a definition here. I won't read it, but essentially this is really about automation. It's about collaborative teams. It's bringing the customer to the core of the discussion and really taking that customer feedback, taking the mechanisms with the relationship that these organizations have with their customers, and enhancing these services at a faster rate than ever before. And as you can see here, it's for large and small organizations. It's non-vertical. It could be anybody. And frankly, if you're not really thinking about DevOps, then you're probably already falling behind. One of a couple key central points here, as we talk to executives, really surround number one, the use of agile development practices. So we don't say to clients, hey, drop waterfall. It's typically you need both. And what it really triggers is a discussion around what are the workloads that are designed for speed, designed for higher quality opportunities, and are better fit for agile deployment. Agile drives iterative development. It drives more teamwork and collaboration. It puts a lot of focus around management and automation capabilities. Another key theme is this whole security opportunity, really bringing into the forefront what are the real requirements that these application workloads can get better and more secured as they're being developed in terms of the code, access to the resources themselves, and then making sure that you can track access and track the changes throughout the life cycle of these iterative deployments. So as you can see here, there's tremendous amounts of interest in DevOps. There's a growing interest in getting DevOps teams to talk more about security. And then, of course, there's lots of collaboration that's required to really understand that, while this is about speed and quality, it ultimately can drive a lot of tremendous innovation, not just in terms of software code quality, but also in terms of recognizing the best cloud architectures that workloads should be on, getting better prepared for compliance, audit, and security requirements for these workloads, and also just getting teams on the same page so that there's a common repeatable outcome for these services that are deployed faster from the software factories that utilize DevOps. Now, one of the things that's pretty important is the really looking at, critical trends. And there's a couple things here that when we're working with DevOps organizations, we really look at pretty closely. Number one of the tenets or foundations for any successful DevOps project really is, well, first and foremost, understand who the customer is. You have to have a central perspective about who they are, how they perceive value, and then how are they judging value from that experience. Now, of course, we all use online applications, so a lot of times an online application is the way we experience a particular outcome with a customer or with a company. But there's no doubt that understanding, well, where is that access? Is it from a laptop? Is it from a remote location? Is it from a mobile phone? Understanding what type of performance and security is that customer experiencing? And are they feeling confident that whatever they're entering into your application is going to be secured moving forward and that the transaction is going to be successful? So really having a good, clear understanding of not only who the customer is, but how they perceive value and what their experience is throughout the journey of the use and interaction with your company. Now, to help drive that, there's this theme of automation. And when you think about DevOps or DevSecOps, you really think about how can automation drive more, not only automated processes, but can also interact with manual interactions if they're required throughout that process. So driving, whether it's configuration management, analysis around code scanning, and certainly access to resources and the tracking of those resources and tracking of that access in an audit trail. These are all ways that can drive more and more automated processes across not just development, but operational teams. And in fact, on the ops side, we're seeing more and more of these firms really look at automation of application performing, the use of scanning technologies, access control, and really making sure that they've got predefined requirements outlined before they write a single line of code for DevOps projects. Another common theme of automation is moving from manual to automated testing, as well as automation of application release cycles. Now, this sort of touches on modern application delivery. And when you think about modern application delivery, you really think about container-based architectures. You think about functions as a service, serverless architectures. You're also thinking more and more about converged fabric, as well as just modern code bases and languages that are driving faster deployment cycles and higher quality of services in a more iterative fashion. You can't do these things without a strong leader. And IT leadership, when you're doing DevOps projects, really has to understand a couple things. One, which is there's going to be political inertia, right? The old saying about there's roughly about 33% of folks who are ready to change today. Then you've got another 33 or 34% that are open to change but not quite ready. And then you've got the remainder, about 33%, that never want to change. They're on a retirement cycle. And there's nothing wrong with those. But the reality is that you have to have a strong leader who's willing to take on this transformational challenge, that's willing to fight the political inertia, willing to grease the skids when new tools have to be acquired. So there's a lot of change management that this leader has to be good at, as well as communicating what these teams are doing longer term, both the short-term wins as well as the sustainability of these DevOps projects moving forward. Now, another key area is organizational design, understanding the roles of folks and what responsibilities they have. And this is pretty critical because when you look at, for example, how infrastructure and operations teams are changing, we're advising more and more of these groups to look at adding programming capabilities, right? Because API programming is so important for software-defined networks, as an example. And of course, for DevOps, integration is a key point, whether it's integration with existing security tools or buying new tools to drive further security visibility and checking of access controls, checking across application codes and various other layers of security. So understanding the roles is pretty important and explaining who does what in terms of accountability for DevOps. In addition, integration and tool rationalization, we just talked about the need to really reconsider not only the existing legacy tools you have, but potentially buying new tools that are more supportive of a faster deployment cycle, that understand that the modern way of application delivery is changing things in terms of access control, in terms of application scanning, in terms of new hardware and cloud infrastructures, and even in terms of management, orchestration, and automation. And of course, what we all know is that regardless of all these discussions, that every application has predefined security requirements. They always have and they always will. And whether you're talking about information security, audit and compliance, access practices, these are all things that more often than not, application workloads have predefined requirements for achieving these outcomes. So it's really important when you're thinking about DevOps and these critical trends, really ask yourself, why wouldn't you add security to the discussion? We always have these discussions with executives, and really they come out of these discussions saying, I do need to think more proactively about security. It gives me an opportunity to innovate, and since I'm putting all this resource and effort into changing how I'm developing applications, security is just another pre-requirement. I need to add it earlier in the cycle so that I can drive more secure application deployments as well as better outcomes from a security audit compliance standpoint. So the other thought process here is, when you think back over the course of the past 10 or so years and the explosion of open source cloud-based architectures, around 2007, I think was the big iPhone launches. We've had major security breaches, DevOps. You really start to see this need for IT redesign. And as you think about DevOps, you think about modern security practices, there's a couple swim lanes here that really are driving redesign. One, the move from waterfall to agile, and really understanding how these development methods change the types of skills you need. It highlights the type of importance of communication, collaboration across teams. It also puts, the need for having a really defined understanding of who the customer is, what they value, and then it really pushes IT leaders to think about how they communicate value to the business managers. There's an old saying that the language of business is finance. And when you think about metrics and you think about how DevOps and deployment frequencies, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, that's great. But line of business managers, general managers, they don't care. What they care about is revenues. They care about quality of product. They care about time to market, net promoter scores, things like that. So really being a translation layer as you're redesigning all the technology investment from a people, process, and technology perspective gives IT and executives a tremendous opportunity to be more strategic to the business, but to really, in fact, drive the business. We talked about innovation paths and modern organizational structures. That's really part of the DevOps conversation is really about an operational focus, redesigning operationally not only how applications are developed, secured, managed, created, but really how does the organization structure itself. The rise of product management is one outcome. Another one is really the importance of architecture, because traditional architectures, it's really hard to adapt to the speed of what DevOps application deployments require. Primarily because traditional architectures have so many waterfall dependencies and so many interlocks amongst changes that DevOps moves very, very quickly. Agile moves quickly, and it makes it really hard for traditional architectures to adjust quickly just because of the number of dependencies that these changes often drive. The fail fast mentality, this is another cultural change that DevOps drives, because more and more executives realize that, the multi-year deployments just don't work anymore. They're too old and they're too slow. And so it's a competitive disadvantage to do that. But when you have a mentality and executive that is willing to take risk off the table for teams, willing to fail fast and then learn from failure, correct that, and then move forward, that's a much more positive, much more business-centric outcome you're going to have. And that's a big part of DevOps. The other side to this is really understanding, as you're making these changes as an IT executive or practitioner, you have to communicate what's in it for the team tomorrow. They really have to have an understanding of, hey, you're asking me to do something different. I'm okay with that. But what do I get out of it personally tomorrow? How does it help me do my job better? What can I, do I have to continue to wake up at 2 a.m. on Saturdays, or actually will that be taken off my plate because I'm going to do this better and things are going to be more secured moving forward? We talked about the mentality of executives more and more, and particularly when you look at companies that are really driving this notion of the technology architecture becomes the business architecture. So there's tremendous, it's not alignment, That word is very 1990s. Now it's very much about the savvy IT executives and teams are driving the business strategy. They're driving new business product innovation, they're driving faster product development cycles, and they're driving more secure outcomes. So these are, it's one and the same. You really shouldn't, if you're doing DevOps projects, look at security as something that's going to slow you down. In fact, what you should look at it as an opportunity to drive more security innovations. And what we've seen early on are companies that are doing this type of practice with a DevSecOps type of perspective are actually having more secure application deployments, having less security breaches over time, and they're actually starting to think about how they can pre-package security as a feature of different applications moving forward. So hopefully you're starting to get a picture of why organizations are using DevOps practices and making these bold decisions. And when you think about the three key themes here, and it's really themes about DevOps in this webcast, first is speed and quality. And I can't tell you how many executives that we've talked to and advised, when we really net out what they want to achieve, it comes down to two key high-level metrics. One, which is speed, and then the other is quality. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can communicate speed and quality in a minute or two. But it's really exciting because when you really take a step back and you think about speed and quality, and as a customer, when you've had this experience, it's amazing how much loyal you are to that company. But it's also just as important that these are really, really hard capabilities to duplicate. In other words, if you embed speed and quality mechanisms into your business processes as you're doing DevOps, as you're improving security mechanisms, it's really, they're sustainable competitive advantages there for your business. And they're really hard to duplicate. The second is customer experience. Of course, that's where we talked about that. And then finally, investment and operational optimization. And this is really about, every company has challenges operationally. And this is a great way as you're reinventing your development processes, your security processes. It's a great way to not only think about tool rationalization and investment optimization, but organizationally, the operational capacity that you have and how that will increase with more automation and improved collaboration. Now, when you look at these bubbles here, these are some examples here. And this really, when you think about these bold changes, some of the outcomes are improving the speed of feedback for developers, creating a real-time feedback process so that not only do you gather customer feedback faster, but you actually act on it faster. And this can be really, really important when you think about security innovation and issue remediation. And then as you're going through the process of deployments, everybody wants faster automated deployment cycles with reduced code error rates. So we're seeing a real hot issues around containers and container security. We're seeing a lot of companies look at how agile sustainability can take hold across their organization. And a lot of this surrounds the discussion of repeatability. And it's repeatability of a build, deploy, and test process. It's repeatability of having a repeatable common outcome across not just deployments, but across security mechanisms and across availability of the applications from a performance standpoint. And then also we're looking at lower change failure rates and improving mean time to repair. So, this is a lot of executives we work with love this slide because what it really enables and what we really talk to is, you talk about metrics. And in technology, there's pretty much no one I've ever met that can't tell me their technology metrics and what they're doing as it relates to development or IT operations or security or infrastructure, what have you. But, when you really parse it down to DevOps, we've got here a leading list of technology metrics that really speak to the development side of the house for the most part. Deployment frequency, lead time for changes, change error rates, failure rates, availability on the ITO side, recovery times, MMTR, things like that. So that's really important. But what's even more important if you're going to go down this path and make these investments is, well, what's that mean to a line of business manager? What's it mean to the general manager of a unit who is you're supporting and you're driving? And that's really where things start to get interesting, because these executives, the business executives, always talk about revenue and profitability. They talk about net promoter score. They talk about customer renewal rates. More often than not, they're talking about time to market, customer satisfaction. And so what's exciting is when you really think about these metrics, you can start to parse them under those umbrella terms of speed and quality. And then you start talking about what's that customer, right? Who's that business customer? Could be internal, could be external partner. What do they really value? Does that general manager really want a better quality product? Do they want a more secure experience, as an example? Do they want higher productivity from their sales teams around the globe? Or are they really looking at, hey, we just need to lower our costs because our profit margin wasn't on par with what we need? Or sometimes they're talking about time to market, which is a great speed metric. So that's how you really think about translating all the technology metrics that you're going to achieve successfully with DevOps projects to, well, what's it mean to those business managers and those business customers that we're serving? And then how do they perceive the value from those metrics? So it's a great way to drive tremendous conversations with these executives that, number one, build credibility, but that, number two, it really gets you a seat at the table where you can say, hey, we're driving the business. We're not just aligned with it. We're driving the business, and we're driving speed and quality, and we're driving a more secure experience. So as we've thought about security and DevOps, these are 6 sort of best practices that have popped up time and time again during our conversations and advisory with IT executives, specifically around security and DevOps teams. Because I can't tell you how many developers we've advised and developer teams we've talked to, and they say, oh my gosh, security, I've never even thought about it before. But the reality is that that's the point, right? If you're doing DevOps, this is about change. This is about doing something that's been done in the past, doing it better and doing it more efficiently and more effectively. So one of the first things we always talk to these DevOps teams about is, well, define what security is. Right? I mean, security, there's lots of layers. It's very complex. And really, it's an easy conversation to have with security teams, regardless of who you are, because they love to talk. And they love being proactively involved in engagements. The outcome that DevOps teams want in terms of a repeatable outcome that's secure is the same outcome that security teams want. It's the same outcome that IT executives want, and certainly the same outcome that business executives want. And so one of the things we talk about is, well, define what security means. We talk about app security, information, access control, infrastructure, mobile. What is it? Really have that conversation, which helps everybody understand what you're talking about. The second thing is, communicate with audit, security, and compliance teams in their language to the extent that you can. And so a lot of times, when you're talking about DevOps and you're talking about code error rates as an example, application scanning tools are an opportunity. A big challenge for DevOps teams is driving access control, right? Because you're opening up access to folks who maybe traditionally haven't had it, but you also have to track that access. Resource access to code, to infrastructure, databases, etc. So really having that is a really important opportunity to communicate with security teams in language that they understand. Another thing we've seen some organizations do is actually make DevOps part of an enterprise resiliency strategy. So we've typically seen some of this happen in financial firms, certain retailers, where they are pretty proactive in recognizing that, since they're going to make the investment in DevOps, that security should become a function or a feature set of each workload, and that should be part of the conversation right from the start. The fourth best practice we've seen is organize a separation of duties. And again, this is something that's been a thorn for quite some time. But as you're bringing agile teams together, Scrum teams together, you're looking at product management, project management, you're thinking about architecture, having clear transparency of who does what is very important. But then also understanding, hey, security is a big part of this. So understand who's going to do what on the teams and how these teams are going to interact across, security, DevOps, and operational and architecture teams moving forward. The fifth best practice here is really, consider different types of controls That's one of the key themes of this webcast is, access control. Auditors, compliance teams, they have certain objectives. They don't care if it's a manual or automated process, but history shows us that automated processes are by default more secure. So you've got to really think through who's going to have what types of controls do different folks need, and that could include as you think about DevOps, that could include product managers from business units as an example, or a certain line of business execs. And then finally, process transparency. One of the things that the cloud has brought, that the explosion of mobile devices, mobile apps has brought, the explosion of container-based and cloud-based development platforms. Gosh, a lot of layers, a lot of complexity, a lot of risk. And so when you're doing DevOps projects and you're really able to show process transparency for certain applications, how the different processes come together in an automated fashion, who are potentially different teams involved. It could be internal, external teams. Could be application outsourcers as one common external partner in these discussions, and then certainly bringing these processes together for security and audit teams, because the more process transparency you can show to them in terms of, for example, how you're going to provide access controls, how you're going to scan for application code errors. These are all things that security teams are more than happy to help out with. In fact, more often than not, they can give you a lot of great subject matter expertise on how to approach this. And they want to become part of the process because it drives a more secure outcome. So these are our 6 best practices that security DevOps teams, we help out with, and it seems to have driven a lot of successful outcomes. So, one of the themes of DevOps is collaboration. And this is, continues to be important, particularly with security. And I think, this whole theme of security as an application feature drives, that really should be one of the mindset requirements for DevOps teams, because, security teams can be a part of every DevOps project. The second piece here is, configuration automation tools don't offer security analysis, access controls. They do something really well for config. Whether it's application config on the development side, or infrastructure and operational config tools on the infrastructure side. You really have to have a really crisp articulation of where security fits, and then what are the real requirements for security as you move forward. This whole partner model. This is another thing too that's pretty important as you're looking at infrastructure and operations teams, architecture, engineering, QA. You really have to have a partner mindset. And I can't tell you how many infrastructure and ops teams we talked about when we're having discussions with them about DevOps, and we ask them, hey, are you doing DevOps internally? They say yes. And we ask, are you part of it? They said, well, not really, not yet. And so we say, well, then you're not really doing DevOps, right? You're doing dev. So, it's pretty interesting that as these transformations take place, security is a part of this. And so partnering with these teams and really rethinking, the old ways that have gone, and how you can improve new innovations with this new modern development process is really, just gives you tremendous opportunities. And it should really only be looked at as upside. You're going to have small wins. You're going to communicate them. Your leadership's going to take advantage of the business outcomes. But at the end of the day, everybody wants the same repeatable, secure outcome. And that's, part of this discussion. It's got to be. DevOps offers points of innovation opportunity for security teams. We hit on that a number of times already. Cross-team product due diligence teams, and then, sharing partner best practices. One of the biggest things we've seen for DevOps is infrastructure and ops teams start to understand that they move from sort of a, availability performance mindset, which is still important, but they move to really a partner mindset so that they understand that they can become more around performance tuning. And part of that discussion increasingly, particularly when you talk about software-defined networks, is security. And so, adding development resources, programming resources, really getting in front of DevOps projects more and more, having security teams as part of the conversation, because there's so many layers that security plays a role in DevOps, but there's also, that means so many opportunities for innovation that frankly weren't available before, because now you've got these modern converged fabric architectures, you have public hybrid cloud architectures, and then of course you have new modern application coding languages, as well as modern container-based architectures. All these things require security, and it just doesn't make any sense to us at IDC if you're not going to think about security in the same vein that you're thinking about reinventing your development and operational processes. So you're probably asking, well, how do we do this? Where's the fit? So this is a really simplified slide here, but when you think about DevOps, more often than not, we're talking about release, config, monitor, automation, security. And there's a number of things, a number of layers here that security enters the realm. Information layer security, access layer, application layer, audit and compliance dashboards, and just broader sort of software-defined lifecycle, such as application scanning tools. So when you think about security and DevOps, just right off the bat, here's a number of intersection points where you can drive security innovation just by having some of these conversations with your DevOps teams. And it's just, it's a great way. It's amazing. I've seen some of these meetings, and it's amazing to see just how the conversations just get really, really interesting very quickly as these development operations and security teams come together to talk about security as it relates to these different DevOps projects. And there's a lot of different, people say, well, where do I start? Well, you can start just about anywhere, right? Whether you're talking about moving from manual to automated testing, you're talking about continuous integration, continuous delivery, you're talking about application performance and analytics, you might be thinking about application release automation. All these DevOps-oriented projects have security opportunities built in. So it's a great way to kick off the conversations with your security teams to drive a more secure outcome. So, how do you look at security and DevOps? Well, one of the ways is you can have a secured pipeline. So when you have conversations with these DevOps teams and they talk about continuous delivery integration, they're really thinking about how can we organizationally drive a more automated software deployment pipeline. And anybody who has some exposure to development realizes this is pretty hard to do, because every application is often written for a particular architecture or a particular environment. And as those changes, as the application becomes more complex, there's more interdependencies built in. So, as you can imagine, it's like a waterfall effect. You make one change and then 50 other changes are required. So, securing a pipeline for deployment is really around organizational access, change control for automated and manual changes. And what are some of the ways you can start to think about this? Well, first and foremost, if you approach your security team today, I'm willing to bet, almost bet, because I don't really bet, but I'm willing to bet that they probably have a bunch of API libraries that are security related. They probably have some predefined ACLs, predefined policies. They probably also have some dashboards that they require for audit and compliance. I'm certain they often have strict access control policies and audit trail requirements. And so all these things are tremendous opportunities to really go in and talk about what you're going to do as it relates to deployment, automation, as it relates to continuous delivery and integration, and to just say, look, we know you have predefined requirements for security. So how can we take advantage of those requirements, make our lives easier because you're baking in security, but also realizing that you're doing something that's pretty advanced with continuous delivery and integration to start with. So, put the effort into security and it gives you a tremendous opportunity down the road. Now, as you think about, pipeline security, you can have source control, build, and artifact management. And, again, as for those of you that maybe don't have this exposure to software development lifecycle, this is a pretty straightforward way to look at it. And one of the things that you'll see here is just a tremendous opportunity for security. And access control is such a big thing when you're bringing DevOps teams together, and they really need access to certain code to certain infrastructure for release and deployment, for testing. And this, what this slide and the next one shows are the really security points of integration where you can, if you're talking about source control, you're going to have requirements for access. If you're, and not just at the application layer, but you're going to need it for the infrastructure team, at the team level. And then as you move to the build discussion, you're going to need more access control. And you're going to have it around configuration and change management. You're going to have it for, if you're doing open source development, most companies are doing some level of that today. Well, you have policy checks for that. If you're, building the code, you're going to have source code analysis, build to commit traceability. You're going to inject code analysis tools. So as you can see, right off the bat, from versioning and source control to building the code itself, there's tremendous opportunities for security discussions. This third one here, artifact management, you really look at access control there because you're going to have to fix code issues that come up. And as you're managing the artifacts, a lot of times you're going to have version control. And then, of course, open source is another key factor here as you're enforcing policy and change management. So this is, at a high level, just introduces how you can talk about security across the early software development lifecycle for source control, build, and artifact management. Now, this next slide takes us into production deployment. And as you see here, left to right, before you get to that point, you're going to have non-production deployment. So you could have some canary deployments. You can have access control for folks who have to go in and review, test, look at automated configuration scripting. And then, of course, here you got an opportunity for the chaos monkey, where you can cause chaos in an intentional manner before it goes to production, so you can figure out where there could be security gaps, where there could be performance gaps, or just code issues, code errors. As you get to testing, one of the more common DevOps starting points is moving from manual to automated testing. Well, of course, you got change controls and you've got compliance testing here. You probably want to automate attacks against pre-production code. So a lot of ways that you can inject security in the testing discussion. And then finally here, as you're going to production deployment, a best case scenario is that you've got your code secured, you've done all your testing, you've got your UI testing, you have a good sense of who the customer is and what they value. But nonetheless, you still want to think about automated testing of production environments, automated configuration and change management. You want to validate all changes as they're coming through the iterative agile process. And then, zero downtime deployment's the goal. So you've got, again, as you look at the software development lifecycle, tremendous opportunities to inject security conversations across every layer of the process. So what are some additional best practices for DevSecOps? First and foremost, you can identify business requirements that involve digital transformation. You can create a roadmap and timeline and include security compliance and audit considerations. Again, define what the expectations are for the different roles involved here from the teams. We talked about defining what security means. The last two slides really gave you a sense of how you can think about, access control, how you can think about application scanning tools, how you can think about information security. Leverage automation, that's a key theme for DevOps moving forward. It's also, I think, a key theme for a lot of security teams moving forward. Train line of business managers and project teams using DevOps, subject matter experts, utilize DevOps communities internally to drive more and more best practice adoption. And then, of course, we talked about separation of duties a few minutes ago. So final considerations here. Number one, understand what your current people, process, and technology are, not just from a development and ops standpoint, but from a security standpoint. Make sure you're empathetic towards folks. DevOps teams often don't have security expertise, but what they do have is a lot of knowledge about how security can be injected into these processes to create a more secure application. That can save a lot of people's jobs. It can reduce business risks, and it can drive a lot of innovation because you're already reinventing how you deploy, create, and manage apps to start with. Consider the type of security you can use. We talked about access, control. We talked about application security. Lots of different ways that you can talk about security as it relates to DevOps processes. More and more, I think, as we look at this next, 5, 10 years, security is going to become just a function of an app. If you look at companies that are really utilizing thousands of container-based architectures, cloud-based platform as a service architectures, we're seeing more and more people think about security as a function or a feature of the app itself. And then, of course, always start small, think big. When you get these early wins, communicate them, have a strong IT leader that communicates the metrics, not just in technical metrics, but in business metrics, and make sure that they're over-communicating the wins so that more and more budget can come this way and that you can drive more and more workload through these DevOps processes.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. With that, I'd like to turn it over to John Walsh. John, I'll give it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Red. So Steve talked quite a bit about DevOps and what's important to DevOps practitioners. And really, it's about speed and quality, right? And trying to do that in as affordable way as possible. And some of the ways you can do that is quick and easy access with it throughout your environment, and not having to be slowed down by the time it takes to provision access to those different hosts or as machines come on and offline. And this is especially important when you're talking about cloud and DevOps, where you have more and more machines, more and more devices involved in the process. There's a lot of access to grant, a lot of users involved, and it becomes very difficult to figure out who has access to what, and to provision that access on a one-by-one basis is very cumbersome. And how do you stay compliant? The key tenet of compliance is knowing who has access to your data. And how do you make sure that's happening throughout this process? And how is that not slowing you down? And how is provisioning that access not slowing you down, or figuring out who has access to what? And you want to do all this with no additional processes or steps or any sort of extra overhead that's going to slow you down. So you want all of this and make it cheap, right? Which is, I think, pretty difficult to come by. So one of these things that's slowing you down, and it's a roadblock to provisioning access and getting things done quickly, is the credentials themselves. Things such as passwords, SSH keys, because you have to generate the password or the key, and then you have to secure it afterwards. You have to put it in a secure vault, rotate it, manage it, control access to that, and make sure no one's stealing it, because you don't want someone breaching your environment and taking all of your data and all the code you've spent all of your hard time trying to build, right? And so these credentials end up being that bottleneck. And here's some points to reinforce that, or some things you may have seen in your environments. Third-party access tends to remain longer than needed. Usually if a third party comes in to do one job, and then he's supposed to go away afterwards, and you want the access to go away too, but that doesn't always happen. I know I've seen that happen in any company I've worked for, and you've probably seen the same thing as well. And to make things worse, the credentials you grant to them don't expire. They just remain forever. So you need to remove them. And if someone leaves the company, the same holds true as well. You may take away their badge, their key, but do you take away their other credentials? Chances are you probably don't, right? And these credentials, sometimes they're mistreated or mishandled, and that ends up being how people are breached usually. It's through carelessness or just a mistake. It's human error. That's always the consistent thing in the process, is the human factor and the mistakes they make. And one of these is checking your credentials into GitHub. When you check in your code, you accidentally check in those keys, and now they're exposed to the network, and everyone has them. We've had recent activity where hackers are actually going out and scanning websites for credentials that were exposed to the network. And that's for the purpose of using those credentials to breach the environment later on. And they wouldn't do so if they didn't think they would have success with that. And then the time it takes to provision that access could be very slow as well, because you're using tools that were built in 1990s, before cloud or DevOps were even thought of. And they're just not keeping up with the times. So you need to be able to provision that access quickly and automatically. And then managing each of the users you have, the devices they have access to, and each of the credentials that user has. That expands exponentially when you're talking about more machines, machines that are temporary, or users that come and go or change teams. It becomes quite a headache to manage all of that. So how do you get around that? How do you make this all quicker? Well, as I mentioned before, I believe those credentials are the bottleneck, or roadblock, if you will, that prevent you from getting there and slow all of this process down. So the way we do it is credentials are no longer provisioned one by one or in a static manner. They're provisioned on demand and just temporary. They only exist for as long as needed. So you can think of these as maybe single-use credentials, and if that user is still supposed to have access, they're granted credentials again later. And then that means there's no rotating, managing, or vaulting those credentials, and it becomes a benefit for security because it reduces your attack surface, and you don't have as many credentials for an attacker to come in and steal. In fact, you have none because they go away once they're no longer needed. So credentials and provisioning credentials and managing those credentials and the access they provide is no longer a roadblock to DevOps delivery. And you don't need any agents on the servers, so no additional software to manage or control. And you can control groups of users with role-based access, RBAC, instead of controlling each user one by one or each credential that user has access to or a little different host they have access to. It's much more easier and much more efficient. And if they move from one team to another, you simply just change their group access to that team. Or if they're a temporary contractor, you set it to expire when they leave 30 days, and you just remove them from the group membership. It's all done automatically. And so with this, you gain automatic compliance and separation of duties because that user only has access to the host and machines for their duty, right? So that's the very definition of separation of duties. So that you gain that automatically, and it's proven in real time automatically on a continuous basis without having to worry about it. So it becomes much more efficient and automatic, and you gain all of the security best practices you're supposed to have anyways. So it's not slowing you down, and you gain it automatically. And then you have very low touch or no updates on the endpoints. Once you set everything, you can set it and forget it. You don't have to worry about reconfiguring each server or provisioning access as new servers come online or new users join the company or leave. You can automatically control all of that with this mechanism. And in the process, this is a headache for a lot of people. We've been hearing, we've been doing surveys, and we hear back from a lot of people. Passwords and credentials and SSH keys are a big headache. So you can eliminate those in the process. So how do you do this? It's with PrivX On-Demand Access Manager, and here's a quick example of how it works. Very high-level architecture diagram. You see here's a user trying to log in to machines that he's supposed to have access to, and he's an IT admin. You see here color-coded in purple, and he wants to gain access to machines that IT admins are allowed access to via their group membership. So he tries to get access, and then PrivX On-Demand Access Manager will check to see what type of role he belongs to using your favorite directory or a combination of factors, such as Active Directory, LDAP, or AWS IAM. And once they determine that he's the IT admin based on this, PrivX On-Demand Access Manager will generate a temporary short-lived certificate based on that information that will allow the user to have access to the machines that IT admins are allowed to have access to. And you see here in this example, there's other machines out there that could be several groups or however you decide to organize the separation of duties. This user does not gain access to the developer group. So in summary, PrivX On-Demand Access Manager, you can make access easy and secure in the process by automatically provisioning access based on the user's group membership. And you can control that access, and you don't need to worry about managing, vaulting, or securing the credentials for security reasons, which is very important because if someone does steal your valuable source code or any other type of intellectual property you have, that's going to slow you down quite a bit, and that's going to cost you more than trying to resolve these issues in the first place. And you can do this automatically without having to add additional steps to the process along the way. And you can automatically make sure you're compliant all the way, because people only have access based on their group membership. So you're guaranteed separation of duties. So make access easy, secure, affordable, and compliant. Automatically manage DevOps access, compliance, and security all in one. Privileged on-demand access manager.